I'm going to talk about two abstracts that have been presented at this meeting, and they're both clinical trials for lupus. One involves a treatment called dapirolizumab, and the other a treatment called obinutuzumab. And I want to make a couple points about where we're going with clinical trials for lupus using these as an illustration. So dapirolizumab is a construct that targets CD40 ligand. We've had issues in lupus before trying to develop treatments for CD40 ligand. One of these treatments didn't work at all, and the other treatment actually was associated with some severe risks for thrombosis. And those programs were dropped for many, many years. But there was some work that suggested that the issue with thrombosis had to do with the part of the molecule that actually binds to cells, which is called the Fc part of an antibody. So this construct has gotten rid of that, and they're using what's called the Fab fragment, which is the business end that targets the target. And then they've linked that to a rather benign construction to get it through the bloodstream called polyethylene glycol. So this was a phase 2 study. They had designed it to be a very small study. There were only 182 patients, and although that might seem like a big enough phase 2 study if you only had 2 treatment groups, they had 4 treatment groups. So each group, there weren't that many patients in it. And for that reason, it really wasn't statistically powered to show proof of efficacy. They were looking for was what might be the best dose to carry further into research. And actually the data looks quite promising. They were able to distinguish, at least in trends, differences between treatment and placebo that were quite consistent, although they had done a pre-constructed way of examining dose response that didn't pan out. I think they have a lot to work with now, and they were able to see a difference between treatment and placebo for further study, not to prove it, but for further study.
What the study showed was that even though the primary outcome measure was not met, there were many, many secondary signals showing decreased pro-inflammatory markers, and that the agent was completely safe. On the basis of this, the sponsors have decided to go forward with a larger phase 3 trial. I view this as a very, very important study that blocks T cell activation, in addition to the one I just mentioned, which blocks B cell activation. And I think that we are on the road to making major progress in the management of lupus.
The next trial I want to talk about is a nephritis trial, and it concerns obinutuzumab. Obinutuzumab is an antibody to CD20. We've had several failed programs with antibodies to CD20, but as everyone knows, rituximab, which is at least has a similar target, is used widely around the world for nephritis off-label because the doctors have spoken. And so, you know, it has been a compelling issue that the early trials of these treatments in nephritis had an awful lot of steroid on board. So in this trial, they too were quite aggressive in tapering the steroids, and they were able to meet some endpoints, and it looks pretty exciting.
The outcome was that the patients who received the monoclonal antibody had definite improvement. The results were that 55% of them received an improvement in their renal function and their renal outcomes versus 22% in the placebo group. And a complete renal remission was seen in a higher percentage of patients getting the monoclonal antibody. The patients who received the monoclonal antibody had almost all had obliteration of their circulating B cells, as would be expected with this antibody. There was a definite drop in double-stranded DNA antibodies and complement levels. So the study met its endpoint, which was a remarkable achievement. And based on this, the FDA has designated this to receive breakthrough therapy for lupus nephritis, which means that they will expedite the review and hopefully approval of this based on coming phase 3 trials for lupus nephritis.
The result of the study was that the patients receiving the study drug had statistically significant improvements in complete renal response and partial renal response. This gives rheumatologists and nephrologists an extra option in treating this disease. Obinutuzumab is already on the market for lymphoma and leukemia, so safety issues have already been reviewed and approved by the FDA. It is very helpful now that the sponsors who are embarking upon a phase 3 trial will hopefully have a good result such that this very, very important agent can be approved for lupus nephritis in addition to its current indications.
This represents a major breakthrough in therapy for difficult lupus nephritis. One should realize that this is a monoclonal antibody that is an advance over what we currently have for rituximab, which is approved for treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. This new antibody, which goes by the trade name Gazyva, is approved by the FDA for treating chronic lymphocytic leukemia as well as follicular lymphoma. So this would be an extension of its approved use in lupus nephritis. So all in all, this is a very exciting and amazing breakthrough therapy, one of the first new drugs in many years for treating systemic lupus.
Well, I think tying these two studies together, we're making progress in lupus trials because we've got a complicated disease. When we have the sicker patients, we need to treat them fairly aggressively in the background, and when you do that, it's kind of hard to make sense out of the clinical trial. But we're learning to taper as tolerated in the patients who can taper. If you can't taper, that's fine. Then you don't meet an endpoint. That's fine. But we'll understand what we're working with, and it'll be relatively safe for the patients. Sicker subsets of patients, taper the background meds. I think we're making progress in lupus trials.